mouth and the mind of another human being, and in this case, the most important human being on the planet, that's got to be a really tough job.
Well, the key is to remember that it's not your speech. And I think the reason so many great writers don't like being speechwriters is that they want to have ownership of the speech. But in the end, it's the president's speech. And the key to that process is remembering that the American people did not elect a speechwriter. They elected a president, and they want to hear his words. And no president is going to read a speech that reflects the views of their speechwriter. They want to read a speech that reflects their own views. And I think you'd be surprised how involved presidents are in the speechwriting process.
I know it varies a lot from president to president. Some are, of course, very organized. We're told that Bill Clinton was still making changes to his speech over one of his State of the Union addresses in the limo heading to Capitol Hill, and that, in fact, the teleprompter revisions were being dropped into the remarks that he saw on the screen just seconds before he read them. So different presidents have different approaches in that regard. How was George W. Bush?
President Bush was a very tough editor. He had a very logical mind. He liked to see a very clear, logical progression in his speeches. And for a speech like the State of the Union, he expected his speechwriters to show discipline. So if you jammed some other idea into a paragraph that didn't really fit there perfectly, his eye would go right to that sentence and take a big Sharpie and cross it out. And he was not afraid to use his Sharpie.
Fair enough. As we go to some more calls here, in reference to the previous caller, your take on what happened in Iowa last night.
Well, I think in some sense this worked out perfectly for the president tonight because if you look at the disarray in Iowa, here you have the president appearing in his most presidential setting, because really nothing makes a president look as presidential as appearing at the State of the Union. And you look at what happened in Iowa, and it really does seem the opposite of presidential. It makes all the candidates appear small, and we don't even have a clear outcome of what happened there. So in some sense, the timing works very well for the president, and it worked well with impeachment as well, because here you have members who were raising the question of whether President Trump should stay in office. And, of course, again, here he is looking quite presidential tonight.
Frank in Cumberland, Maryland joins us now. Good evening, Frank.
Good evening. An earlier caller said that President Trump was not paying any attention to the national debt. But a recent letter to the editor of the Cumberland Times News said that in 1999, Donald Trump proposed the passage of a national wealth tax of 14.25% on all individuals with a net wealth of $10 million and higher. Apparently, the Democratic radicals also have the same goal. Why isn't this being mentioned? And is it feasible? Can it be done?
Well, first of all, the president has shown over the years, to put it mildly, a great versatility of conviction, Frank. He's had a lot of viewpoints over the years. He's had virtually every viewpoint there is to have on abortion, for example. He was once a registered Democrat. And, of course, I would note that 1999 is 21 years ago, and now he's president. And he has possibly changed his mind. We certainly haven't heard that come back up. Jonathan Horn, your thoughts about how the president has, shall we say, evolved ideologically over the years?
I think that's true. He certainly has shown that he can change his mind on issues very quickly, and sometimes we have to say for political expediency. So unfortunately, the national debt does seem to be an issue that people tend to care more about, and to be perfectly honest, especially Republicans when they're out of power, and then when they get back into power, they tend to talk a lot less about the problem of the national debt.
1-866-50-JIMBO as we go to Tim in Medford, Wisconsin on the Bohannon Show, looking back on the president's State of the Union address and ahead to the final impeachment vote. Good evening, Tim.
Good evening, Jimbo and Mr. Horn. My question has to do with the aesthetics here. Jimbo, I loved your analysis of how the State of the Union has become kind of a big infomercial. And in that case, the opposing party response almost seems to be like the disclaimer we see in so many of those commercials for new medicines now.
That's very well put.
I remember the first Democratic response President Trump was from Joseph Kennedy III, and he did it in a gymnasium in Massachusetts somewhere, surrounded by a lot of dyed-in-the-wool Democrats who every time he would mention something that the Democrats support, fighting global warming, open borders, blah, blah, there would be applause and so forth. There would be a response to his point. And ever since then, they seem to have dropped that setup, and it's gone back to the dull, boring, quiet, looking directly in the camera, trying to refute the president silently. And I'm wondering why the change from that.
Yeah, interesting point, and our guest can respond to that. I would note that it's always difficult because it's almost impossible to really refute. You don't get a transcript of the president's remarks until pretty close to the evening involved, and so you can generally approach what you think that he will say, but in terms of a point-by-point refutation, as you see in a traditional debate, that's very tough to do because you can't be positive about exactly what he's going to say.
And I would add that if you look at the way our country is set up, there really shouldn't be an opposition response to the State of the Union. The State of the Union is a job that's given to the president in the Constitution to report on the State of the Union. There's not necessarily supposed to be a rebuttal to the State of the Union. In the very beginning of the Republic, the House and the Senate would make responses as an institution to the president, but there wasn't necessarily a political party making its own response. So I don't really think a rebuttal necessarily works to the State of the Union, and that's one of the reasons why it always continues to be an awkward affair every year when it happens.
We'll return with more from our guest, former presidential speechwriter Jonathan Horn, author of Washington's End, and we'll be back in just a moment.
We have purchased the finest planes, missiles, rockets, ships, and every other form of military equipment, and it's all made right here in the USA. We are also getting our allies, finally, to help pay their fair share.
President Trump's State of the Union address, and of course, like all State of the Union addresses, they don't tend to be great rhetorical flights of fancy. They're a shopping list of things that people might want to consider as they cast their ballot in the next election. Jonathan Horn, our guest, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, as we talk to Sean, driving across Missouri this evening. Hello, Sean.
Good evening, gentlemen. Jimbo, thank you for your platform and forum of information you have nightly. It's always interesting.
Thank you.
You haven't spoke about your author's book, but I am looking forward to that point of history. I want to make a couple comments on. I thought it was a successful speech. I only listened to it on the radio, so I missed some of the visuals. But what an embarrassment that the Democrats had for not showing a lack of a unity, but not giving support to what would be national, exceptionalism. They just stood on their hands. He didn't shake her hand, which is a sign of friendship and fidelity, which they have neither. But he did give a couple of jabs to the Democratic Party. I think when he talked about legislation that he's not in favor of, or they're not in favor of, the 132 Congress people that are not in favor of late-term abortion. That they support
right.
late-term abortion, and 130 or so that are for sanctuary cities. Those are an embarrassment. If you can't support those issues, that you're not for an American agenda, not for American people. You're definitely not for life in pursuit of happiness.
Well, I mean, clearly this is one of the great areas of contention in the country today. And one thing I've heard people talk about, the gridlock of Congress, Jonathan Horn. The Congress is supposed to represent the public. And quite frankly, we're a deeply divided country. So I suppose it's appropriate that the Congress is equally deeply divided.
I think that's right. That's the way our Congress is set up. It's supposed to be at times divided if we're divided as a people. And I guess one thing your caller just mentioned is the theatricality, I think, of this speech. Of course, there was that moment in the beginning where it appeared that Donald Trump refused to shake Nancy Pelosi's hand, which I think personally he should have done. And then there was a moment at the end of the speech where it seemed that Nancy Pelosi tore up the president's speech.
Yes, I mean, seriously, I thought that's what I saw. I couldn't believe it, but yes.
I've never seen anything like that before. And, of course, there is some danger at the theatricality of this speech. It's already quite theatrical, and if it goes too far, you do wonder what the future of the State of the Union is.
Yeah, 1-866-50-JIMBO to Debbie in Pittsburgh. Hi, Debbie.
Well, good evening, Jimbo, and good evening, Mr. Horn. If I ever need a speechwriter, I'm going to look for you. I like your attitude and your manner. But Jimbo, I called you last night and I told you that I was not going to watch the speech because of the disrespectful behavior of some of the members of Congress at last year's speech. And so tonight I listened to it on the radio. And when I heard the boos and I heard the comments that they were not being respectful, I said, well, they haven't disappointed me this year, and it just goes to show that you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But when Nancy Pelosi even refused to applaud for a member of our military returning from their fourth deployment in Afghanistan, or to acknowledge some of the other folks, like the little girl that had been born so premature and whatever, I really lost any respect that I might have had for her, but nothing prepared me for what she did at the end by ripping up the speech there and being absolutely disgraceful. And I wish that there was a word I could find that would even be more reflective of what I think her behavior was than disrespectful. And, I never thought I would say this, and tomorrow I may indeed have a different perspective. But because of her behavior, I truly hope that until they lose their bid for re-election, which I think many of the Democrats in Congress will, I hope that squad makes her life miserable every day that they're in office, because she deserves it. And I wish I could be a little fly on the wall to see it, because I think they're going to try to split that party. And I almost hope that they do. I'm not sure that I do, but I almost hope that they do, because she's disgraceful. She's disgraceful for that position in Congress.
All right. Interesting thoughts, Debbie. As we go to the break, I just, Jonathan Horn, I have watched a lot of State of the Union addresses. I cannot recall ever a speaker acting, of course, as a backdrop along with the vice president. I've never seen a speaker so completely uncomfortable.
I think that's right, and I think there will be a lot of Democrats tomorrow who will wish that Nancy Pelosi did not rip up the speech at the end.
Yeah. More to come. We'll be back in a moment. Yes, no mistaking that chant, and that was reverberating through the halls of Congress as the president wrapped up his State of the Union address. We're talking with Jonathan Horn, the author of Washington's End. Of course, George Washington did not face such great divisions in the country and was beloved and respected right through the entire of his retirement. Not true. Boy, this book, Washington's End, puts an end to that myth.
That's exactly right. We have this image of all the founding fathers being the best of friends. But what if I told you by the end of George Washington's life, he was no longer on speaking terms with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, or James Monroe, and he had just had a very serious feud with the sitting president of the United States, John Adams. George Washington's last years, the years after he left the presidency, were anything but peaceful.
Yeah, it was really amazing. And on at least, I guess, a couple of occasions, and this was back in the days, of course, you didn't have social media. You didn't even have telephones, for Pete's sake. And so you get near somebody's house, if at all possible, you're going to drop by and say howdy. Tom Jefferson on his way to Monticello, his home, had to go right past Mount Vernon and just kept right on going past, coming from the north, from Philadelphia. Didn't even bother to stop, and I guess there would have been little point in stopping. Those two did not get along at all toward the end.
That's right. In fact, just at the time that Thomas Jefferson is passing Mount Vernon, a letter that Thomas Jefferson had